Yeah, okay. All right, so welcome everyone. As you know, for some time now, we've been doing this Faith and Art, St. Catherine of Bologna series, and we've talked about many great masterpieces of Christian material culture. We were inspired to do this because of Pope Benedict and Pope Francis's teaching on the Via Pulchritudinis, the way of beauty. And it suddenly occurred to us recently that we haven't actually talked about what constitutes the beautiful. So many of us feel comfortable saying what is beautiful, what we find beautiful, what we don't find beautiful. But when we're actually asked to give an account of what is comprised by the beautiful, what is entailed by the idea of beauty, we struggle. So I thought we would talk a little bit about that, and hopefully we will be able to render clear to ourselves this whole concept of the beautiful. So what we often hear are these terms, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. We hear this quite a lot today, and I think that there are two ways by which we can think about this expression. We can say, well, it's false, it's just a false term, a bit like Hume. So David Hume said, quote, "Beauty in things exists merely in the mind which contemplates them." Right? So the idea is there that you have the concept of the beautiful and you merely project that onto things, right? But it's not that the thing itself is beautiful, it's that you have this idea which you're then projecting. And you can do that with the concept of ugliness as well. Or you could understand it in a different way. You could say, well, true beauty is an aspect in things, right? It's an aspect in things. And we apprehend that, but we only apprehend that because we're rational beings, okay? So, obviously, the first kind of understanding of beauty has really, really influenced the concepts of modern art, right? Or arguments behind modern art, okay? So it's not so much that the thing is beautiful or not beautiful, because that's only a projection in the mind anyway. The most important thing is actually that you understand the intentionality of the artist, right? So then you'll have something like this. This is a picture by, an installment by Sarah Lucas, the British quote-unquote artist. And you'll go and you'll have a look at this, and it will have a large plaque next to it with an explanation about it, because you can't actually get anything from the thing itself. So what you really need to do is learn the intentionality behind the thing. Okay, now when I say beauty is actually something that's in the thing itself but can only be apprehended by a rational being, you see this in the world around you. So we will see a spider web with dewdrops on it, and we'll stop and we'll say how beautiful that is, but no other animal is going to do that, right? So a dog or a deer or the spider itself is not going to step back and contemplate the beauty of the spider web. So that's why this is something I only want to predicate of a rational being. Now, the first thing to say about beauty is that even if we don't agree on what constitutes beauty, or we don't agree on whether something is beautiful or not, we all accept, generally speaking, I think, unless you meet a real skeptic, and then you have to argue this out, but we all generally accept that there is a shared experience of beauty. So, just to give an example, if you were standing with somebody and they said, "Gosh, isn't that sunset so beautiful?" You would instantly be able to say, well, that's an experience I share with them. If they were to say, by beautiful, I mean it causes me great anxiety, and it causes me to want to make acts of gratuitous and unjust violence or something, you would say, okay, I think you've either misunderstood the term beauty, or you're mad, or something's gone wrong here. But but you would instantly recognize that there isn't a shared experience there. Now, this is important because Aquinas, when he comes to deal with beauty, the first thing he wants to talk about before he says what constitutes the object of beauty is he wants to talk about the experience of beauty, right? So he says that the notion of the beautiful is that which calms the desire by being seen or known, right? So why do people every year all round the south of England go and take breaks in the Cotswolds, for example, right? Because walking through these villages, these places where hundreds of little negotiations have taken place every day for centuries about the kind of way in which people want to live together, has created, through all of these little micro agreements, this place of settling and beauty where people can actually reside and enjoy their environment, right? This is why, of course, aesthetic ventures should never be rushed, right? Because generally, the kind of environment that we create around ourselves comes through all these little negotiations and agreements, that most of which are completely tacitly made anyway. So, why do they do this? Because it calms the desire. Let's put it that way, right? Now, one objection we might have to this is that we might all know the inner experience of beauty, but that doesn't actually mean that there's anything objectively beautiful about the things we're talking about, right? So this is very much the Humean angle here. Now, in saying something is beautiful, we're not actually talking about the thing itself, we're just categorizing our own feeling, right? We're not saying anything about the object. Now, why would someone perhaps want to make this argument? Well, because there are lots of disagreements about what is beautiful, okay? So somebody might decorate their bedroom in this way. I would want to say that they've made a mistake, right, if they've decorated their bedroom in this way. But there are many people who have decorated their bedrooms in this way. So there's just a disagreement here about what is beautiful. So somebody might want to say, well, actually, this is just because beauty is a subjective thing, and you're only talking about your own feelings. You're not talking about the object of your apprehension. Well, the first thing we should say about this is that just because there is a disagreement about what is beautiful, it doesn't follow that there is nothing objective to say about what is beautiful. You know, if you saw two people arguing and one person was getting red in the face, saying, 2 + 2 is 4, and the other person was saying, no, 2 + 2 is 5, right? You wouldn't want to conclude, well, because there's a disagreement before me, right, there must be no right answer here, okay? So what you might want to say is, well, let's engage with the equation or whatever and work out what's really, where the mistake has arisen. So my own teacher, Roger Scruton, who is considered to be quite an important figure in the field of aesthetics, he says something very interesting by reflecting on his own feelings when he comes to encounter the question of beauty or questions pertaining to aesthetics. He says, quote, "When I describe something as beautiful, I am describing it." Okay, so even when he reflects on his own feelings, he realizes that his feelings are intentionally ordered to something beyond himself or the feelings with which he's engaging. When I describe something as beautiful, I'm describing it and not my feelings towards it. I'm making a claim, and that seems to imply that others, if they see things correctly, would agree with me. Moreover, the description of something as beautiful has the character of a judgment or a verdict, and one for which I can reasonably be asked for a justification. I may not be able to give any cogent reasons for my judgment, but if I cannot, that's a fact about me, not about the judgment. Okay, end quote. Now, just to sort of draw this idea out a bit, if you were to see the Pietà of Michelangelo and you were to be standing with somebody and looking at it, and that person, again, were to say to you, this is just really ugly, right? This is not good. And maybe say, I would ascribe to it the same aesthetic value as, say, roadkill, right? We would think that not only had the person made a mistake, or that they were mad, or that they were sort of trolling us or something, but we would also actually make a moral judgment about the person, right? We would say that we might actually be dealing with a bad person here, right? So already we can see the kind of objectivity with which we want to approach this, right? Okay, so when Aquinas comes to deal with the objectivity of beauty and not merely the experience of our own desires in relation to beauty, he wants to come to it through what's called the transcendental attributes of being. Now that sounds very sophisticated, very difficult to get your head round, but actually it's a very simple idea, which is to say that we can attribute to things some things that are specific to those things, right? So this wine is transparent, I can see through it, whereas this control is not, right? So I can attribute something to this that I can't to this, right? But being, for example, is something I can attribute to both, okay? Now, the idea is here that being and goodness and truth are things that can be predicated of anything in as much as the thing exists, okay? There is a long tradition of saying that beauty is one of these transcendental attributes. And this is an idea that reoccurs over and over again through history. You get it in Keats' poem, of course, Ode on a Grecian Urn, the last lines. Beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. If the transcendental attributes are attributes of being per se, and God is absolute being, what does that tell us about God? It tells us that God is absolute beauty, right? And this is going to become a very important idea when we think about the relationship between religion and art. Okay, not only that, in so much as something is, it imitates the nature of God. Okay, so in so much as something has existence, it imitates that which is by nature existence, which is a necessary being. And for this reason, in a little while, I'm going to argue that all art is religious. And the reason I want to take this position, a radical position on this, is that I want to say all reality is religious. Okay? Now, I'll come back to that idea and I'll qualify it in a little while. So, when Aquinas comes to deal with the objectivity of beauty, as I said, he wants to go through the transcendental attributes. And he says the following. Quote, "For beauty includes three conditions: integrity, or perfection, since those things which are impaired are by their very fact ugly; due proportion, or harmony; and lastly, brightness or clarity." The three conditions which Aquinas mentions here are in fact the three primary transcendental attributes of being as understood through the prism of aesthetics. So the first one, integrity. Now, this conveys the reality of the thing. This is the radiance of the form, and it communicates that the individuated object conforms well to its universal nature. We understand that it's beautiful because we see that it is good, and so it has integrity. It is, and is seen to be, the sort of thing it is supposed to be. Okay? The next thing, proportion. By this condition, we grasp the order and the unity of the object, particularly how it is ordered toward its proper finality. For this reason, it is said that everything is beautiful that is in due order. That's straight from Augustine there. In this, in the case of a human being, interestingly enough, this has a very dramatic effect on the moral sphere, right? Because somebody who is disproportionately given over to pleasure, they lack some of the important virtues, temperance, kindness, self-regard, etc. We tend to conclude that this person is a kind of existential ugliness, right? So here we are. This is a Hungarian Vizsla, right? And a lot of people would say this is a very, very beautiful dog. Why? Because it's perfectly proportioned, right? It's a perfectly proportioned dog. And it has a very, very, you could say, there's something, there's a very sort of proximate relationship between this instance of a dog and the universal idea of dog. When you think of a dog, you have this kind of perfectly proportioned creature in mind, right? Visually, if a dog has some kind of abnormality or something, then you have another problem, right? So, for example, this is Picasso, is the name of this little dog, born with this facial abnormality, and we wouldn't say this is beautiful. This lacks something that the dog should have, right? Now, we're not making a judgment on the kind of pet that this dog might be or how affectionate it is. Maybe it's a very sweet, very loving dog that would make a terrific family companion. Nevertheless, we would not want to breed this facial structure into the dog itself, right? We would try to avoid that, because we don't consider that to be the form that a dog ought to take. Okay. The next thing is clarity. And by this condition, the object is understood, its intelligibility is seized. The object is beautiful because it reveals its ontological reality clearly, and the truth of it is known. It is via this condition that we can not only answer the question of what is it, but we can answer this question with real precision. So, for example, if you were to take the ecstasy of Saint Teresa, we can see exactly what the sculpture is seeking to convey, then the truth of it is known, and the object is deemed beautiful because what the artist wants to convey to us is very easily grasped. And that is why, of course, this is so loved by so many people. Now, not only are these three conditions, integrity, proportion, and clarity, not only are these conditions convertible with one another, but they are obviously the transcendental attributes of being, as understood through the prism of the beautiful. As they are the conditions of beauty, so too they must be convertible with beauty. And this, of course, logically means that ugliness is not something because it can't be convertible with being. It's actually a privation in some being. Also, this means that whatever is beautiful. Whatever exists is beautiful. And in the hierarchy of being, as I said a moment ago, that which most is, namely God, is that which is absolute beauty. And you get this idea coming down to us from the Greeks, and this is central to the Platonic conception of aesthetics. So the most famous, introduction to this is given to us in the Symposium. So the Symposium is one of Plato's dialogues on love. It's a conference, really, with many men drinking wine, I think that's what a symposium is. I think if you get rid of the wine, it's a colloquium. So I think that's pretty much what a symposium is. You're drinking wine and you're talking about love, and the more they drink, the better the conversation gets. And eventually, when they get to Socrates, he introduces people to this figure, Diotima, who is a priestess. And he describes her as really the person who taught him everything he could ever say about love. Okay? And in the symposium, Diotima, through the mouth of Socrates, says the following, quote, "Like someone using a staircase, he should go from 1 to 2, and from 2 to all beautiful bodies. And from beautiful bodies to beautiful practices, and from practices to beautiful forms of learning. From forms of learning, he should end up at that form of learning which is of nothing other than beauty itself, so that he can contemplate the process of learning what beauty really is." Okay, the broader point here is that, and this has had a huge influence on Christian thought and architecture and so forth, it's the notion that what can be known via the senses, when beautiful, may be a way by which we ascend to the contemplation of that which is immaterial. This is so crucial for the whole Christian aesthetic tradition, because what it means is, through beautiful forms, we may know God. Okay? Now, St. Augustine, who was intellectually downstream from Plato in being one of the many church fathers to synthesize the Christian deposit with Neoplatonic metaphysics, says the following, quote, "One should distinguish between beauty and beautifulness as the cause of embracing at once all beauty. For having made this distinction in all being between participation and things participating," so what's he saying here? Those things that possess something as an attribute, and that which is that thing, right? So contingent beings, objects that we have of our experience, are merely beautiful, but they are not themselves beauty. And he's saying we must distinguish between those things that merely have beauty and that which is beauty. For having made this distinction in all being between participation and things participating, we call beautiful the thing which participates in beautifulness, because from it is imparted to all reality the beauty appropriate to everything, and also because it is the cause of proportion and brilliance. So it's an ancient Neoplatonic idea that essentially everything, all of our experiences of beauty in the world are a kind of fragmented reflection of their source, which is beauty itself, or as a Christian might want to say, beauty himself. Now, Jacques Maritain, the great 20th century philosopher, he summed this up in its Christian reception in a really interesting way. And it's an extended quote, but I'll stop if I need to as I go through it, because this gives, in a very lucid way, a sense of what I'm really talking about. He says, "The beautiful belongs to the order of the Transcendentals. That is to say, of concepts which surpass all limits of kind and category." Okay? It's attributed to everything that is. "And will not suffer themselves to be confined in any class, because they absorb everything and are to be found everywhere. Like the one, the true, and the good, it is being itself. Considered from the certain aspect, it is a property of being. It is not an accident, that is to say, something that is attributed to in instances of things. It's not an accident superadded to being. It adds to being merely a relation of reason. It is an aspect of being. So we can look at being through the aspect of beauty. It is being considered as delighting. That's the aspect. As delighting. By the mere intuition of it, an intellectual nature. So, he continues, everything is beautiful as everything is good, at least in a certain relation. And as being is everywhere present and everywhere various, the beautiful likewise is scattered everywhere and everywhere various. Like being and the other transcendentals, it is essentially analogous. What does he mean by analogous here? This is a very, very important concept, because for a long time there was obviously a view that you could only talk about God in terms of what he was not, right? So he was not a creature, he was not limited, right? He was not finite, and so on. And every time we said something positive about God, like for example, he is infinite, right? What we're actually saying is something negative, just in positive language. We're saying what we know him not to be. Now, what the Christian tradition added on to this within the philosophical sphere is to say, no, we can say positive things of God by analogy, right? So when I say this glass of wine is good, I'm saying something very different to when I say my wife is good. Okay? I'm saying something very different, but they are analogous to each other, right? They're not completely different, because when I say this wine is good and my wife is good, I'm not saying that either are evil, right? So there is actually a similarity, and yet there's a radical difference. Okay? Because goodness and truth and unity, these transcendentals, are words that we use analogously. And we can, by analogy, get all the way to God. So when we say, God is good, right, we aren't saying something metaphorical about God. We are saying something absolutely literal about God. But we don't really comprehend what we mean by God is good. But we know we're saying something true, because we're saying something by analogy. You can say we've reasoned our way up the analogical scale all the way up to God. Okay? He continues, Maritain, that is to say, it is predicated for diverse reasons, of the diverse subjects of which it is predicated. Each kind of being is in its own way. It's good in its own way. It's beautiful in its own way. Analogous concepts are properly predicated only of God. Very interesting, no? So it's not that when we say God is good, that he is, we can say, on the peripheries of the analogy. He is at the centre, and every time we say, this glass of wine is good, my friend is good, that walk was good, we're actually working down from God and analogously attributing the word good to those experiences of contingent things. Amazing. The Christian worldview always puts God completely in the middle. Predicated properly only of God, in whom the perfection they describe exists in a formal, eminent manner, in a pure and infinite state. God is their sovereign analogue, he says, and they are to be found in things only as a scattered and a prismatized reflection of the face of God. So beauty is one of the divine attributes. Because beauty is one of the transcendental attributes, beauty is one of the divine attributes. Very interesting. These things that we predicate of God can be found, he says, in a scattered and prismatized reflection of the face of God. This is not, let's put it this way, this is not Maritan's Aristotelian side coming out. This is a strongly Neoplatonic idea. And this is going to be central to how we understand beauty. Now, what's interesting is I've been saying that things are beautiful insofar as they exist. But the existence of things is not the only way we can get to what is beautiful. We can also talk about what is beautiful via the essences of things, right? We make a distinction between essence and existence. You can not only talk about that I am, you don't only say that I exist, but you can talk about what I am, right? This is a distinction between my essence and my existence. And we can actually get to the beauty of things through essences as well. This is a photograph of the Ashridge bluebells about 20 minutes from my home. So here we move from the discovery of beauty via existence to the discovery of beauty via essence. Because everything that exists as the thing it is has its exemplar in the mind of God as a divine idea. God knew you from all eternity, as it were. But since God is simple, he can't be divided into parts, right? He is a simple being. He is being, I should say. His divine ideas must be identical with his nature. And therefore his mind is only conceptually distinct from his nature. In turn, insofar as something exists, it imitates the divine nature, and insofar as something exists as the thing it is, it imitates the divine mind. And since the divine nature and the divine mind are not distinct in reality, in all things are an image of God himself. We can say that. And there are certain times when we get a sense of that. This is what Edmund Burke called the sublime as opposed to the beautiful. I get that when I see photographs of the Himalayas, where I spent quite a lot of time in my late teens. Since the divine nature and the divine mind are not distinct in reality, everything is, we can say, an image of God. In some diminished, fragmented and individuated state, but nevertheless a reflection of him. And Aquinas uses different ways to talk about this. He says, for example, that the world is like a portrait, an artist painting a self-portrait. He says that this is a self-portrait of Albrecht Dürer, who I think thought he was God, but he wasn't actually God. But if anyone thinks that they're God, I suppose Albrecht Dürer sort of deserves it because he was so brilliant. But there are other analogies. A very good one is one taken from J.R. Tolkien's The Silmarillion, in which he says that God creates this music through his co-creating angels that brings the world into being. It's actually a finer analogy, because of course when somebody paints a self-portrait, when they cease to exist, the portrait can continue to exist. It's not the case with God. God holds everything in being at every given moment. When an orchestra stops playing, the music stops. We might say that this is a better analogy. But of course, then you lose the primacy of matter in the creative act of God. In the Summa Contra Gentiles, Aquinas says that you can think of creation as God in a conversation describing himself, and that every single thing that he creates is a word in some way indicating the goodness of his own being, right? So there are various ways in which you can think about this. But it's very helpful to think about this because it gives you a completely different way of looking at the world. When you go out and you're going for a walk and you look around and you realise, albeit in a way that is marred and had violence done to it through sin, and for many reasons it's very indirect, nevertheless you are seeing something of an image of God as you walk through the world. Okay, so I've been talking very much about beauty in general. So the question is, what can we say about art? Okay. Well, obviously, if the Platonic view of beauty leads us to this theocentric view of aesthetics, we can presume that Plato had a very, very high regard for art. But when we look at what Plato actually has to say about art, we find that he doesn't like art at all. I mean, it's true that this is a bit sort of anachronistic because there wasn't a kind of coherent, robust philosophy of aesthetics within the philosophical world until Hegel's lectures on aesthetics were posthumously published in the 19th century. But nevertheless, Plato does engage with the question of art, but he always has quite a negative view. And it's always been something of an uncomfortable fact for people who are attracted to Platonic aesthetics, like me, and want to use it to defend the artistic initiative, the artistic vocation, to find that Plato himself has such a negative view of art in general. Plato thinks that art is deliberately deceptive, that it removes the audience from the truth of things, which he thinks is the point of life. The point is to actually grasp the truth, and that art in some way removes us from the truth. He also thinks that art can have very serious moral implications, very serious negative moral implications. He thinks that it can glamorize nasty characters and can lead to immorality and can lead young people astray. Now, my own view is that Plato's view of beauty can be reframed in such a way as to greatly support the work of the artist if it is synthesized with the Aristotelian view of what he called techne. Now, techne is the proper function of the artist, namely the transference of a new form to matter predisposed to receive it. So this was a great big block of Carrara marble, and Michelangelo was able to see that it was that material that was predisposed to receive this form which he was going to inflict upon the marble. Okay? And that actually this is the ideal matter for this, right? No other matter could receive the form of David. Yeah? If he had done this in wood, for example, it may have been beautiful, but it would be something completely different. Right? It would be a different sculpture. And of course, but to get this image, he could not have used another matter. It was this matter which was predisposed. He couldn't have used jelly, for example, to produce that sculpture. The Italians have gone from this to this, by the way. So that's their contribution lately. Now, the fundamental Aristotelian point is that the term techne denotes the imposition of an intelligible form, something you can seize intellectually, on materials by the work of practical reason. So, unlike the beauty of the things of nature, whose beauty points beyond to uncreated beauty, art, resulting from the intentionality of the author, presents itself as an end. It incarnates that very beauty toward which all natural beauties point. This is Alexander Stoddard, who is a sculptor to the royal family, and I had the pleasure of meeting him a few weeks ago, and he's subsequently become a great hero of mine, and he is somebody who is really trying to continue and school people in the great classical forms of the Western canon. This is a man who has taken very seriously into his own craft the kind of aesthetic theory I'm talking about. Now, Maritain conveys this idea of the incarnating of beauty into the world in a very, very beautiful way. Maritain says that, quote, the work which involves the labour of the fine arts is ordered to beauty insofar as it is beautiful, it is an end, an absolute, self-sufficient. And if, as work to be done, it is material and enclosed in a kind, as beautiful it belongs to the realm of the spirit, and dives deep into the transcendence and the infinity of being, as beautiful, because it's convertible with being. Now, for this reason, I want to go back to something I alluded to earlier, which is that I want to say that all art is religious. Whether we're talking about profane art, like this, I'm using profane in the stricter sense of the word to mean secular, right? Profane art, like this very, very beautiful image of a horse by George Stubbs, or pious art, right, which is not the same as sacred art. So here is Salome with the head of John the Baptist by Caravaggio. That is not, that is not sacred art, yeah? You could not, or at least I think you would be hard-pressed to pray before that image, for example, if you were going to sort of ask for the intercession of John the Baptist. That would be a strange image to go to. You would want to go to sort of a statue of John the Baptist, for example. Or sacred art. This is meant to be, it cries out to be above an altar, right? Where the Eucharistic sacrifice is taking place. The Eucharist will be held up before that. Yeah? Okay, so art then can be understood as the mediator between the one subject to it and that which it represents, in order that it, the latter, may be better seized by the mind of the former, right? So there is this, there is the unseen reality, which Diotima says we want to ascend to, and then there is us. And something has to mediate between these two things. And that is essentially what art does in the broader view I'm describing. This is why to see a lily, for example, is quite a different thing to seeing Monet's lilies. And that is quite a different thing again to seeing lilies in the light of Monet's lilies, for example. And yet each apprehension, you can see, that is better than that, right? That is actually, that calms the desire, to use Aquinas' term, more than that. In fact, that looks a bit naff, frankly. Which is because this is so typical, that art is actually the redemption of nature. And when you see the thing that art breaks us free from, you want to go back to the image. Each time you enter into this contemplation, it's a further ascent of the mind into the divine mind. The artist ascends to the mind of God in order to incarnate his apprehension in the world, and he aims at taking his audience with him. In this way, artists and philosophers are alike. They share a vocation. However, they're not only seekers of God, but they're imitators of God as well, because the philosopher tries to imitate God in the possession of wisdom, and the artist seeks to imitate God in the creative act. There are various reasons then why one might want to argue that all art is essentially religious. However, the reason most directly related to the broader view here is that the artist has as his object the deepest meaning of the world. The artist, knowingly or not, traces the twofold exemplarism of the divine nature and the divine mind, which accounts for all of created reality, and incarnates his apprehension in the world, as Maritain was describing. If this view is true, then it does explain why many would intuit a very deep connection between art and religion, and more broadly, the aesthetic experience and the religious experience. Because obviously not everything in the world is sacred, and nor could it be, right? Sacred means to make holy, to set apart from the other things. But according to the view I'm advancing, everything in reality is religious, and to this, art is no exception. Insofar as something exemplifies the divine mind or the divine nature, it is inherently religious. And since all finite beings exemplify God in such a way, all created reality is religious. Art is unique in the world, however, for via the imposed form, the artist adds onto finite being a human intentionality in ordering the mind of the one subject to his work toward the same ascent which he himself has undertaken. The artist is that part of the universe which incarnates by the imposition on matter a new form, that which can be grasped only by a rational nature, techne, and by so doing causes the matter to partake in his rationality, by being in a way infused with it. Art then becomes a type of communication in which this extrinsic finite inanimate being is assumed into the act of conveying a truth seized in a rational nature. Or rather, the truth seized overflows in a dynamic act of expression into the world, being received by the work. This work conveys the object of the artist's contemplation at a depth to which conversation alone cannot attain. The artist's audience unites itself to the work, bringing its own dynamism to it, and thereby shares in the artist's ascent to the uncreated reality, known via the world around him, denoted by the work. So, one may object now, okay, if all art is religious, how can bad art be religious if we agree that religion is a good thing? Well, the answer I would want to give is that bad art is religious in the same way as bad religion is religious, like that of devil worshippers, for example. A blasphemy or a sacrilege is still a religious act. For such an act derives its meaning from its object, namely God. Indeed, bad art, as I have argued, is akin to blasphemy. It's like an assault on the divine order. There's a more pronounced tendency for bad art to emerge in cultures that are desacralized or hostile to religion. The view presented here provides a plausible explanation for this. In turn, many contemporary pieces issued by people who would reject the view of art and the artist, which I have advanced this evening, mark not only a deliberate departure from beauty, but also unity and truth and goodness and nobility and so forth. All the transcendental attributes. There is an option for privation. And that is something quite different. If we're talking about art as the adding onto a finite inanimate being a human intentionality, that's something quite different to merely a poorly executed sculpture or something. This is a human intentionality deliberately choosing a privation. It's very interesting if you try to look for an analogue of this in the moral life, which I'll get to in a moment. But just to say, for example, when Augustine talks about sin, he says the real thing about sin is that because God is absolute being and sin is a privation, you are choosing non-being over being. You are saying to God, return me to nothingness. Return me to nothingness. What we're dealing with a lot of the pieces I'm showing here now, is an option for nothingness. And this is like a single act of desecration. So, all art then is religious, even if it is religious like devil worshipping. The ability of the theocentric ontology, defended this evening, to explain this fact is an advantage given the widespread intuition that art and religion are closely related. It may also be capable of offering some robust support to the sense widely felt that art in the Western tradition has completely lost its way. Beauty as an aspect of the object itself is the way in which we should try to understand the term beauty is in the eye of the beholder, if we want to use that expression. Beauty is an aspect of the object itself, and it would be beautiful whether we were to behold it or not. But no one would know it was beautiful because only a rational being can apprehend beauty. And therefore, for beauty to be the dynamic communication of the object it is meant to be, there must be a beholder. So, let's get back to Hume. If beauty is in the object, why do so many disagree on what is beautiful? Here it might be helpful, as I suggested at the beginning, to try to provide an analogue between the aesthetic judgment and the judgment of conscience, that which pertains to morality. Due to the fact that beauty is convertible with goodness, so too is our mental approach to them comparable, albeit different. Indeed, the judgment of the beautiful is comparable to the judgment of conscience regarding the good. The conscience can be mistaken. It can err. And yet, that does not mean that morality is purely subjective or relative. Each judgment of conscience should rightly be an attempt to judge the moral value of such and such an act or situation in reference to universal moral norms, which have a certain criteria. So too each judgment concerning beauty is really an attempt to judge the aesthetic value of such and such an object. An object of the mind, perhaps, you can have beautiful ideas, not necessarily a particular substance out there. Nevertheless, an attempt to judge the aesthetic value of such and such an object with reference to the criteria which determines whether something is objectively beautiful. And what makes something objectively beautiful? Integrity, proportion, clarity. So there you are, the popular maxim, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, need not be interpreted to imply absolute subjectivism. Just as there really must be a subject, a free agent, for the objective judgment of conscience to be possible, so too there must be a beholder when it comes to the things of beauty, one subject to beauty. Indeed, it's the relationship between truth and beauty which causes us to often describe heroic and virtuous acts as beautiful, whereas immoral or deeply depraved acts are called ugly. Here lies also the reason for increasing ugliness in art and architecture, or fashion, music, theatre, so forth. Within a culture of moral decline, there is such a close relationship between these two things. All people have a basic intrinsic goodness, but that does not discount the necessity of both forming and informing the conscience to make really good decisions. So too, all people have a basic attraction to what is beautiful and not what is ugly. But still, one's aesthetic sensibilities must be educated. For this reason, although there is an objective criteria for the beautiful, one's ability to consistently make good judgments concerning beauty is to a great extent dependent on the personal actuation of the one making the judgment. And there can be a lot of room for genuine disagreement, right disagreement, because there is a kind of prudence which belongs to aesthetic judgment. You know, some people might genuinely think that that picture would be better over there and that picture would be better over there, and that's okay. There is a lot of room for just prudence and negotiation. For this reason, people who have not had their aesthetic sensibilities educated, because there must be a real education of these things, will actually treat things of beauty with a kind of mockery. And yet everyone has this sense, and you see this very clearly when you go into certain art exhibitions, particularly places like the Saatchi collection, for example. So the chap I was talking about earlier, what's his name, Gavin Turk, who did those busts, one of his installments was called Pile. It was called Pile or Dump. I can't remember what it was. But it's rubbish bags dotted around the place, kind of tied up, black bin bags with rubbish in. And the person who goes into the cathedral and marvels and then goes to see those rubbish bags will be told that he's a kind of barbarian. He's a kind of barbarian for not really getting what the artist is doing here. And only really, if you were really educated in what art's really about, you would think that this was genius. The whole thing's a sham, right? The whole thing is a sham. And we can advance pretty strong and robust case against that sort of nonsense. But we actually have to educate our aesthetic sensibilities. In a certain sense, we can say that the degree to which the object communicates its beauty is dependent not so much on the object, but on the actuation of the one subject to the object. For this reason, those open to wonder will often leave a Gothic cathedral, knowing well that they have not received all that the cathedral has to give. In this sense, beauty is a communication of something intrinsic to the object, and therefore, for there to be this communication, again, there must be a beholder who can be a true recipient of this. Now, if I just, as my final point, just take you back to the analogies I used earlier, and in a sense, this, I'm just going to give 2 minutes to this, but it really requires a whole lecture of its own. The analogies I gave to you earlier about how you might see the world as an image of God, you have to take the analogy one step further and say, if the universe is a portrait of God, or a description of God, or a musical composition about God, none of these things even come close to knowing God, right? To that portrait of Albrecht Dürer I showed earlier, by looking at that picture, I cannot say that I know Albrecht Dürer. I can only really say things about the picture and to the degree I've read about him. So art completely changes in the light of the Incarnation. In fact, it's the fact that we discover the universe as an image of God through reason, because that pertains to the sphere of philosophy, tracing the divine nature and the divine mind. It is the fact that we discover the universe as a picture of God that gives rise to natural religion, that causes us to cry out for union with God, and we start offering these natural sacrifices, which never actually bridge the void between creature and the Creator. The only way in which that void would be bridged was if God entered history. If God came and assumed our own nature. And so in the light of the Incarnation, art has completely changed. Because when we create, for example, a cathedral like this, or a painting like this, we are celebrating and communing with one we know. And so, because of the incredible mystery of the Incarnation, art has completely changed, and it can never really be thought of in the same way again. When we look at this, this is not simply a manifestation of our cultural preferences or anything like that. We here commune with the one whose face we behold. And this is why, of course, and perhaps I should have presented an image that illustrates this point a bit. When God enters history, it's a problem if he only remains for a moment, if he only remains for those who lived among him at that time. So God can't only enter history and then go, he has to remain until the end, until the eschaton. The Christianity doesn't make any sense without the Eucharistic presence. And in a certain sense, all Western art ought to be in some way Eucharistic. And all Western art, even a picture of a horse by George Stubbs, stands in the shadow of the Eucharistic, or the incarnational and the Eucharistic mystery. Because the Incarnation, in the assumption of nature, enables us to see everything differently. Everything differently. So, I'll stop there. Thank you very much. And I'll take questions.